Thank you for having me. So I want to tell a quick story in two parts. I run a neural engineering company called Neuroscience. We work on all kinds of technologies for reading and manipulating the states of neurons throughout the brain. I have spent basically my entire life thinking about how to engineer the brain. I talked my way into a lab as a freshman in college and basically never left. That's where most of my education happened. And there are some very serious challenges with recording and driving neural activity throughout deep in the brain, but there's one place where the brain gives you a 2D sheet of cells that you can look at through a window, and there's no bone to drill through to get there, and is as feed-forward of a structure as you get in the brain, and that's the retina. For those who aren't familiar, light shines in from the top. It hits the light-sensitive cells in the back of the eye called the rods and cones, or the photoreceptors. Those connect to a layer of about 100 million cells called bipolar cells. Bipolar means they've got two ends. And then those compress down almost 100x onto the optic nerve cells. And so in diseases where patients have lost the rods and cones, but the brain knows how to see, the optic nerve is intact, these patients today go irreversibly blind, we figured that there must be some way to get vision back into the brain by bypassing the dead rods and cones and stimulating the optic nerve or the bipolar cells directly. Specifically, these are diseases like macular degeneration and retinitis pigmentosa. There's a bunch of variants of this. People can lose the rods and cones for all kinds of reasons. But if you can bypass that dead layer and then stimulate the visual signal back into the brain, we figured that this would be a way to restore vision. Over the last several years, we've worked on a bunch of different ways to do this, and this is a big field that's been around for decades. People have been working on these prizes. Specifically, there's a technology that we own called Prima. You can see the chip here on a penny on the left. If you look at the Prima chip under a microscope, you see all these little hex grids. Every one of these little hex panels is essentially a little solar cell. So this chip is inserted in the back of the eye under the retina, and then the patient wears glasses that have a camera looking out at the world and a laser projector that illuminates the implant in the back of the eye with the scene to stimulate the cells that are still there in the retina. So this is a pretty cool idea because there's no battery, there's no PCB, there's no cable. It's a fully wireless implant that is powered by the light that is projected onto it to get the signal into the brain. It's implantable through this 1-hour outpatient procedure. And this has been in development for about a decade now. It was originally invented by a scientist at Stanford named Daniel Palanker that was licensed to a company in France, and now we own it. And it finished a major pivotal trial in Europe last summer in 38 patients, which to our knowledge is the first time that these very late stage macular degeneration patients have been able to read again. It's a really big effect size. Just to kind of a couple highlights from that trial, I mean, this really seems to produce form vision in the brain that they can take out. They can go read, take out in the world. You can go read signs in the subway station. You can go to a cafe. And so this, we're really pretty excited about these results. This trial was done at 17 sites across 5 countries in Europe. And we knew we'd met the efficacy endpoint, which was being able to read 2 lines. So there's the kind of conventional eye chart, I'm sure many people are familiar with. Usually this is read at 4 meters in front of a patient. If you bring it forward to 1 meter right in front of you, these patients couldn't really read any of it. The endpoint for the clinical trial is being able to read from the 3rd line or below. The mean patient in the study was able to read from the 5th line, and there's digital zoom on the glasses, and with that, the best patients could read the whole thing. And to complete the clinical trial, all clinical trials are overseen by a group called a Data Safety Monitoring Board. They would meet periodically to review kind of the totality of the evidence and vote on whether the trial should continue. And in November of last year, they looked at the results and said that the benefits outweighed the risks, and voted to recommend submission for approval. So we're currently in the process of writing up about 1,200 pages of regulatory documentation to ask for permission to sell it. And so we hope to have that next year. We've had cochlear implants for 50 years. A lot of people have been working on retinal prostheses. There are probably multiple approaches that'll get to market in the next 5 years, but that it does seem like that era is getting on us. So that's Act One. The second part, so this is the sober, near-term, pragmatic thing that is helping people in the near term and is the business that really fuels the company. But we are going after some hopefully even much larger prizes. Which is not like my mom. I grew up around blindness. My mom's dad had retinitis pigmentosa. That is like very profound. If that is the only thing that we really do as a company, I think we'll be very proud of that. But there's a couple much crazier ideas that we're going to get to try. And neural engineering is interesting, at least to me, because your entire conception of reality is rooted in electrical activity in your brain. Like you don't experience the walls like at a distance or things happening in the world. You're experiencing a world model that has been constructed by your brain that's receiving information from the environment. And so if you can engineer with that, if you can alter the brain, you can alter reality in some very profound sense. One of the things that enabled the AI community to start spending really large amounts of money on training these big models was the existence of scaling laws. They had some predictability that they knew that if they trained a model of a certain size on a certain number of GPUs to some number of steps, they would get some predictable performance, and so they could then use that to underwrite these really expensive big training runs. And we're starting to see similar things in the brain. So there's a group at UC Davis that implanted an area of the brain called parietal cortex of ALS patients who were unable to speak, and showed that they could decode language from the brain. They could decode speaking. But as the number of words that the decoder was picking from increased, the error rate increased, although this decreased as you added electrodes, and the relationship seemed logarithmic. So there's a really strong argument for scaling up the number of neurons that you can record from. And I think there's like a lot of companies and a lot of research labs have been looking for ways to record from more neurons. The state of the art today is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 to get this better performance. The problem is that there's no free space in the brain. The brain is this warm, wet, squished together thing. No matter how small or how flexible you think your electrode is, like you can see a picture of it floating off a finger, the brain is smaller. Every time you put one of these into the brain, you destroy thousands of cells, and those cells don't come back. And if you accidentally hit a blood vessel, then you're going to stroke out more cells around there. Now, if you have a serious spinal cord injury, destroying 50,000 cells in cortex to record from 500 might be totally justified. There's a lot of redundancy in cortex. There's a lot of redundancy in a lot of the brain. There's billions of cells. That might be a totally reasonable thing to do. But what it does mean is that you can't scale this up by just putting more in. You can't do this to get to millions of electrodes. We know that when you place things into the brain, they get the immune system responds to them. And even when you're not getting this active immune response, if you're stimulating the brain by injecting charge through an electrode, you get encapsulated by the immune system. Here you can see under the B figure that this is a bunch of electrode arrays that have been now just totally engulfed by these support cells called glia, because what it tries to do is it tries to electrically isolate the implant from the brain, because the brain says, like, this doesn't feel like what I'm expecting, and so I need to encapsulate it so it leaves me alone. There are many different approaches that people have developed over many decades, and really these came out of neuroscience tools. Like one interpretation of the field of neuroscience is that they've been putting electrodes into different areas of the brain and going cell by cell and circuit by circuit, asking like, what do these cells represent? How does this correlate to the world? How does this control the body? But all of them are pretty limited as far as like BCI tools, like BCI, for doing things that go beyond just understanding what are brains and how do they work. So I've spent most of my life thinking about what is the idealized brain-computer interface? Like, how do we add whole new brain areas? How do we repair things that have been damaged? And I think in many ways, the idealized BCI is, I don't know how many of you have seen James Cameron's Avatar movies, is this thing. So all of the information that flows in or out of the brain goes through a small number of cables called the cranial and spinal nerves. There's 12 cranial nerves, 31 spinal nerves. The optic nerve, 1.5 million fibers from the eye into the brain, is cranial nerve 2, carries vision. The vestibulocochlear nerve that carries hearing and balance from the ear into the brain, tens of thousands of fibers, is nerve 8. And imagine if we had a 13th cranial nerve that innervated a lot of the brain and came out, and you had a USB-C port at the end. So this is a totally different type of device. To do this, we're talking about something that is capable of simultaneously stimulating and recording a big area of the brain at single neuron resolution without genetically modifying humans, which is a big consideration because a lot of the things that you can do to get more control or more depth requires genetically modifying the neurons, which you can do in a research animal, but you're not going to do in adult humans. And so of all the technologies that are out there today, none of them, as far as I can tell, even in principle, are capable of doing this whole thing. So the idea that I had almost 15 years ago now, which I think only really became more possible recently, although a bunch of different groups have written about it and thought about it, is what if we take some heavily engineered neurons, embed them in a device, in the electronic device in a dish, embed the cell bodies in a hydrogel so they can't go anywhere, and then engraft in the wet side. So we don't place any like mechanical or electrical device into the brain, it just sits on the surface. But if we just grow these neurons on the surface of the brain, will they grow in and form new connections? Like the intuition here is like the brain is made of a bunch of neurons. What happens if we grow some neurons on the surface of the brain? And if you were to do this for real, you would see an image that looks like this. The neurons are labeled in blue, a little hard to see on the projector here. The graft cells that we've added, the engineered neurons, are labeled in green. Really hard to make out on this projector, but if you look very closely, really throughout cortex, there's little green dots everywhere. So one of the things that we see if you grow these neurons on the surface of the brain is that they grow in and wire up very, very broadly, and then undergo this activity, this pruning after 4 to 6 weeks. You can also see more dramatically, so the first layer of the brain, the layer 1, is the white matter tract. So these are like long-range axons of neurons communicating to other brain areas. And you can see there's this big green bundle that follows layer. So we get this axon bundle that follows layer 1 for a while before breaking off into synapses, which is kind of like what you might expect to see. And so this is an idea that we call a biohybrid neural interface. We think that this is really scalable in a way that many conventional approaches aren't. So we make these chips, load them with cells. This is a zoom of one of the bottom of those chips loaded with these engineered neurons. And when you put these on the brain, I mean, it looks like at first we thought, oh, this like only kind of just pools up on the surface. But when you look carefully, we see these biological processes, both inputs and outputs of these graft neurons growing pretty deep into the brain, all the way, really all the way to subcortical structures in some cases. Here, every frame of this video is a layer. So this is looking into a mouse brain. And the first frame is at the surface, and the next frame is looking down. And so the thing that I'll point out here is you can see the shadows of the blood vessels. So these grow in a completely non-destructive way around the things like blood. Like you're not worried about, do I hit a blood vessel, because the neurons will do this for you. And so this is pretty cool. This gives you a totally new type of cable into the brain, something that's perfectly biocompatible. These neurons should last decades. Does no damage, and gives you chemical synapses, allows you to speak the language of the brain to talk to it. So we recently published a preprint showing that we could use this general approach to talk to mice in some generalized sense of talk. And our goal is to scale this up to something that we think really gets us to like way beyond what people traditionally think of in terms of the capabilities of BCIs. So going from a world of thinking of I've got 100 electrodes or I've got 1,000 electrodes, here, because the neurons are so close to your electrodes can be smaller and more densely packed because the signal to noise ratio is better, so like for a bunch of electrical reasons, you can have smaller electrodes more densely connected together. And so here you can make an 100,000 electrode array, load it with 1 million cells, and get 1 billion synapses throughout the brain. This allows you to access much, much larger areas of the brain. And so there's near-term practical things to do with this, but looking a little bit further ahead, Your head has two hemispheres inside, linked with a connection called the corpus callosum. And we know that if you cut that, you get something that kind of looks a lot like two agents in one head. And we know this because a long time ago, people used to cut this for some very refractory forms of epilepsy. This isn't really done anymore, but these patients were studied pretty carefully. And so you go from like having one unified visual field that you can see and answer questions about to really having two separate experiences in that head. So if you could build a BCI with interhemispheric bandwidth, something that kind of could act like a corpus callosum, you could imagine going the other way. And we know that this must be possible because nature has done it and given us an existence proof. There's a pair of twins that are joined in the brain that can partially see through each other's eyes and experience some of what each other experiences. And so this raises a really interesting possibility. When you experience things, you see things, you hear things, you don't confuse things that you see with things that you hear, you don't confuse internal monologue with a motor command to send to your hand, but you experience them together. You don't have somebody else's hearing with your vision or somebody else's vision with your vision. And the fact that this is possible makes us wonder if it's possible to build a BCI that gives you phenomenal binding over the network through the neural interface. Is it possible to in some really deep fundamental sense, lose track of where one brain ends and another begins and redraw the borders around them? I think that opens up a really wild space of pretty sci-fi sounding possibilities. And maybe even going beyond these senses, these phenomenal modes that you have, things like vision and hearing and somatosensation, would it be possible to build one for something you can't experience today, like an 11-dimensional space that right now it's like you can't really imagine, and then get binding to that and experience it directly? So these are some things that are being worked on. Yeah. Well, thanks.
So this is incredible. Things sometimes take longer to achieve, but the future is coming faster than we think. If you were to look at science in 2030 or 2035, what's your sort of hope for where this meets the both patient experience and the way to brain optimize the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, the first patients that'll get biohybrid interfaces are almost certainly going to be for stroke. But there's all kinds of other, spinal cord injury, ALS, stroke. These will be the first types of populations to get it. I'm perpetually optimistic. I'm sure it will take longer than we think. But I think 2030 is very reasonable for these things being in humans.
And I met Max when I think you were a Duke undergrad. You dropped out for a
Possibly,
bit, went back. Yeah, like 15. So any lessons for the amazing entrepreneurs who you've had this long vision, you've been passionate about this for a while. It takes longer, but it's compressing in time. Any lessons for entrepreneurs like yourself who want to do big, bold things and change the world?
Well, on that note, probably having a long time horizon is like useful. Mm-hmm. That definitely becomes an advantage. I think people chase like short-term trends or there's like something that happens, and then they get distracted or end up in a totally different industry. I think it's also tough to talk about some of these things without sounding like a crazy person. And I think that people have a hard time just trusting their own like logical reasoning, because they'll go one or two steps, and then you'll end up, and that makes sense. They're like, okay, I can do that. But then you play it out like 3 or 4 more steps, and you end up in a place where you're like, that can't be right. I must have made a mistake. Right. But often you're not wrong. Often it is right, and those things like can be possible. It's just intuition breaking, and you kind of have to learn to trust your reasoning ability.
Yeah, well, tomorrow we'll be joined by Ray Kurzweil, father of the singularity in a sense, and looking at that curve. And there's that analogy we've talked about earlier, Mars law. We tend to overestimate what will happen in 2 years and underestimate a decade. So this next decade is going to be incredible. Thanks, Matt, for pioneering it.
Thank you.